I grew up in a small town in the Ottawa Valley, but I went to high school in a much larger town. And in my grade 9 year at St. Joseph's High School, I was taking history, and our teacher, Mr. Keon, who really was quite a legendary guy and had a magnificent way of turning education into a series of anecdotes and well-crafted stories excellently told, well, he wanted to show us a film for one class to help illustrate some of the points that he wanted to make about World War I. VCRs weren't super common yet, and I don't think our school actually had one. So somehow he acquired a film print of a movie that was over 50 years old, took us to the hall underneath a nearby church, set up a film projector, and showed us a film that changed me. It changed me as a lover of cinema. It changed me as a lover of history. It changed me as a student who admired his teacher. It changed me from the kid who grew up thinking war was cool and a game you could play with toys with your friends after school. I've seen this film many times in the years since, and I've thought of Mr. Keon every time. It's amazing how great teachers stay with you, much in the way great films stay with you. It's about the memories of how things and people make you feel. That's what we remember. On this episode of the podcast, we are going to look at this film, the 1930 masterpiece, All Quiet on the Western Front. Hello, film historians. I'm Derek, and I love old movies. We've got Sam the sidekick here.
Hello, and welcome to episode 15.
Which is kind of a big deal episode.
Aren't they all big deals?
Well, sure.
Like, 13 was big too.
Oh, yeah.
And 10.
Mm-hmm. Oh, God, 10. The biggest of all deals.
But this episode?
It is no slouch.
Nope.
Tell them why.
Because we're looking at a movie that is going to bring the thrills, the spills, and the chills. Our all-war movie November continues as we take a look at the first great war movie. One
of the greatest of all time, still.
And simultaneously, one of the greatest anti-war films, too.
Not many films could legitimately fall into all those descriptors, and that's why it's important to celebrate the ones that do. So this week, we are taking a look at All Quiet on the Western Front.
This one is a bit daunting.
The classics always are. It's a lot easier to talk about a film like Too Late for Tears than it is a film like this.
Or Sunset Boulevard.
Yeah. When we started this podcast up, we weren't really thinking about hitting the classics. There's enough podcasts that do that already.
Yeah.
I saw one being promoted the other day. They were on their second episode, and they were doing Jaws.
I couldn't do that. It's too great. Too perfect.
And you love it too much.
I love it too much.
So my point is, people already do that sort of thing. They hit the big ones. So we were just going to hit the not-so-big ones.
And yet...
Well, we pick our spots, don't we?
We do. But it makes me wonder, what do our listeners think? Like, do our episodes on the classics do better?
Well, considering that our all-time most listened to episode is Ghost of Frankenstein, I'd say no. Our episodes on Sunset Boulevard and Dr. Caligari, I'd say those are major classics. They've done fine, but they aren't at the top in terms of listens. I'd say bottom half, actually.
That's interesting. Well, hopefully you guys like this one, because it's a big one.
The biggest.
But maybe let us know what you think. Do you like listening to the episodes on maybe more obscure or lesser-known films? Or do you prefer the classics? Let us know in the comments.
Or, if you need to think of it for a while, get back to us later on any of the socials.
Let's tell them how.
Well, you can find us on the Facebook.
I Love Old Movies, the podcast.
Or the Instagram.
I Love Old Movies, the podcast.
How about the Twitter?
At ILOM Podcast.
Or you can send us a good old-fashioned email.
I Love Old Movies, the podcast @gmail.com.
All one word.
And of course, while you're here, please take a moment to hit like, subscribe, and share.
Totally. Because when you do that, you are flexing the mighty muscles of your coolness. And you are helping our show reach more people. So please, help us do that.
And thanks for listening.
Absolutely thanks for listening. Whether you are in Canada, the United States, or around the world, like maybe in Barcelona, Spain, or something. The best part of doing this show is sharing it with you.
That's true. In fact, we had a comment from a listener that we wanted to share. It came from friend of the show, Robin Saunders, through Facebook.
I'll just read the comment here. You and Sam have picked up where the late Elwee Yost of TVO fame left off. I'm glad to see the gap has been filled. Keep up the great work. I'm very impressed and a big fan.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Robin. Comments like that mean a lot.
They sure do. We love reading them on the show. So like we said, get in touch and let's share what you're thinking with everyone. I remember watching Saturday Night at the Movies for years and years and years. To be compared favorably to Elwee Yost is really flattering. I'm not sure many of our listeners outside of Ontario will know who we are referring to, but trust me, in our province, he was the guy when it came to having a film show. Thanks, Robin.
Yeah. So, this week, All Quiet on the Western Front. You've been wanting me to see this for years.
Oh, that is true.
Then let's get to work.
Our director is Louis Milestone. He was born in the Ukraine into a Jewish family who pushed him to study different languages and engineering. His desire to pursue the dramatic arts was discouraged from a young age, but when he turned 18, he finally got his chance. Milestone moved to the U.S. in 1914, where he quickly took on any odd job he could find in order to support himself. 3 years later, he joined the Army Signal Corps to make an educational short film for U.S. troops. After that, he moved to Hollywood and met William A. Seiter, who is a director at Insay Studios. In the early 20s, Milestone worked on projects with Seiter as an editor, assistant director, and even screenwriter. He directed his first solo film, Seven Sinners, in 1925, and directed Two Arabian Nights in 1927, which he won an Academy Award for. In 1930, he directed All Quiet on the Western Front, which is regarded as his greatest film, and he won his second Oscar for it. Milestone was known to mount cameras on a wooden track to give his films a more fluid look, and was also well known for his snappy dialogue and interesting visual touches. Some examples of this are the comedy The Front Page in 1931 and the melodrama Rain in 1932. Milestone was also known for being a difficult director who had a history of clashing with Howard Hughes, Warner Brothers, and other studio executives. Despite this, he maintained fairly steady work throughout the years and even managed to be employed by most of the major studios at the time. However, in 1949, he was blacklisted for about a year due to some left-wing affiliations he had made back in the 30s. By the 1950s, he was getting less work and not as consistent, and he ended his career with the remake of Mutiny on the Bounty in 1962. He died in 1980 at the age of 84.
The writer of the novel this film is based on is Erich Maria Remarque. He was born into a German Roman Catholic family and was conscripted into the German Imperial Army during World War I at the age of 18. Not even a month after being sent to the Western Front, he was wounded with shrapnel and evacuated to an army hospital where he spent the remainder of the war recovering. After the war, he worked several different jobs, including being a librarian, teacher, and journalist. Remarque's first paid writing job was as a technical writer for the Continental Rubber Company, but he actually started writing at the age of 16. One of those projects was a novel that was later finished and published in 1920 called The Dream Room. 9 years later, his greatest work, All Quiet on the Western Front, was published. It quickly became an international bestseller and inspired the commercial publication of war memoirs. It also inspired dramatic representations of the war in theater and cinema. Over the next few years, Remarque wrote many similar stories, including The Road Back in 1931. In 1933, the Nazi propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, declared Remarque's writings as unpatriotic and banned them in Germany. While Remarque quickly left the country to live at his villa in Switzerland, his French background and Catholic faith were being publicly attacked by the Nazis, to the point that his German citizenship was revoked in 1938. Just before the start of World War II, Remarque and his wife moved to the U.S., where they obtained citizenship in 1947. His next novel, Flotsam, was published in both English and German in 1941, followed by Arc of Triumph, 1945, which was another instant bestseller. His final novel was Shadows in Paradise, 1971, which was published after his death. He died in 1970 at the age of 72.
It takes a special actor to play a special role, and All Quiet's Paul Baumer is a point-of-view character that required perfect casting. An actor that had the youthful, wide-eyed look, but also the gravitas for the emotional requirements of the role. Enter Lew Ayres. A college dropout who is pursuing musical ambitions as a banjo and guitar player, Lew Ayres was discovered by a talent agent and transitioned quickly from a bit player to a lead, starring opposite Greta Garbo in The Kiss in 1929. In 1930, his legacy in Hollywood was all but assured after starring in All Quiet on the Western Front, a film which not only defined his career, but also his personal life. Ayres worked steadily throughout the 1930s, appearing in several films a year, but it was towards the end of the decade and into the 1940s, and after his failed marriage to Ginger Rogers, that he starred in 9 films playing Dr. Kildare. This popular series took him into the war years, when he was drafted to serve in World War II. But his views on warfare were so negative, especially after starring in All Quiet on the Western Front, Ayres applied for status as a conscientious objector. This led him to falling out of favor, not only at his studio, but with the public. Ayres wound up serving in the medical corps and as a chaplain's assistant, even requesting a rank reduction to assume these postings. Ayres received 3 Battlestar commendations during the war and donated all of his salary to the Red Cross, but when he returned home, his career was very different. Although he was able to play Dr. Kildare on radio, he was passed over for the role on television, and aside from Johnny Belinda, he had no well-received films. By the 1950s, he was mostly a television actor, doing one-offs and guest spots in an endless string of TV shows, such as Climax in the 1950s, Gunsmoke or Marcus Welby in the 1960s, Columbo and Kung Fu in the 70s, and Magnum P.I. and Fame in the 80s. One of his later roles in film was the first film I ever saw him in, Battle for the Planet of the Apes, where he plays Mandemus, a philosophical and pacifist orangutan who keeps not only the weapons of Ape City, but also the conscience of Caesar. A fitting role, considering his own sensibilities. Lew Ayres passed away in 1996, at the age of 88.
Louis Folheim, owner of one of the least photogenic faces in cinema history due to a nose-flattening football injury, was an intelligent and talented actor. Recruited and mentored into a career on stage and in film, Folheim had a degree in mechanical engineering and had been working as a mathematics instructor before transitioning to the entertainment industry. Most of his career was spent in silent films and appeared in the 1920 version of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But most movie fans will remember him for his bravura role as Cat in All Quiet on the Western Front, which not only exposed his talents to a wider audience, but gave him the ability to have a supporting role in a Best Picture winner. His portrayal, so full of wisdom and vulnerability, care and sacrifice, is one that deserves to be seen and remembered. Tragically, he was never able to reap the benefits of the film on his career as he died in 1931 from stomach cancer. Louis Folheim was 50.
Based on the novel by Erich Maria Remarque, All Quiet on the Western Front is an American retelling of a German novel about a group of impressionable young men that are cajoled into enlisting at the beginning of the Great War. It is a film that does not glorify war, nor the heroism that wartime can inspire. It's a film about drudgery and misery, about regret and about loss. It's not only the ultimate anti-war film, it's the ultimate coming-of-age story. Only in this tale, becoming an adult means learning to understand and accept the futility of war, and resigning yourself to the fate that death awaits you and all those around you. The supposition of what war is contrasts nightmarishly with the reality, leaving not only the characters, but the viewer deeply shaken by what they experience. A violent, graphic film, it has the benefits of a large budget, a director with a free hand, a studio and producer who deeply believed in the film, a pre-code production, scores of former German soldiers working as extras who helped with realism and authenticity. And it's as good today as when it took audiences by storm 90 years ago.
Right. This film was not without controversy. Certainly in Europe, this film generated a lot of attention.
Oh, it sure did. The German government, even pre-Nazi, hated the film, as they felt it portrayed the German army and people as cowardly, and that the film was inherently anti-German. The film was, of course, eventually banned there, and requiring massive recuts in order to be released there properly. But Poland also banned the film, seeing it as too pro-German.
It seems there was some perspective in those opinions.
Yeah, just a bit. The film did big business in Switzerland, France, and the Netherlands, with special buses and trains set up to transport Germans who wanted to see it across the border. Meanwhile, the film was banned in New Zealand for being anti-war, banned in Australia for being pacifistic, and also banned in Italy and Austria. In Germany, before the film was banned, screenings were regularly attacked by members of the Nazi Party who threw smoke bombs or released live mice into theaters to panic audiences and force evacuations.
Wow. That's just incredible that the reaction was so intense. I mean, you see people getting all Twitter offended at movies today, but it's nothing like that. And this is pre-internet.
Yeah, so no echo chambers on Reddit to just fuel the fire. This was all grassroots and government reactions.
I can't imagine that happening today. Amazing. And yet, in spite of all that, this film is still considered an undisputed classic.
Oh, for sure. Obviously, it was an award winner in its day, but history has also been kind to the film, with the AFI placing it at number 54 in its top 100 list, and at number 7 on the list of the greatest epics of all time.
I mean, we hear about things being epic, but this film literally is.
Now, it did have a sequel, as well as a remake from 1979, but while both are good, neither really hits the heights that this film does.
Ernest Borgnine is in the remake, right?
Yeah, he plays Cat, and he's all right.
And the sequel?
Well, it was called The Road Back, and it was based on the book by Remarque. It was directed by James Whale, and was intended to be a masterpiece. But, as so often is the case, that didn't exactly happen. The tale of that film? That's a whole other podcast.
Okay, maybe down the road.
What's the tale of the tape on this one, Sam?
So we have an 8.1 on IMDb. The audience score is 89% on Rotten Tomatoes, and the tomato meter is 98%.
Absolutely.
The film won the Academy Awards for Best Picture and Best Director, the Kinema Junpo Award for Best Foreign Language Film, and was added to the National Film Registry. And the film can be rented online through many services.
We open on a title card and a military band playing a solemn and bombastic piece.
There's no Universal logo. I missed that.
A text card introduces us to what is about to follow with the ominous words, "This story is neither an accusation nor a confession."
We see German soldiers, new recruits, marching through town as an appreciative crowd cheers them, and that leads us through a very clever camera shot into a classroom.
A teacher lectures his students, giving them a message of nationalism and stoking up fervor for the war. "Strike with all our power," he tells them. "You boys are the life of the fatherland." He completely inspires them and cajoles them, and the students begin to daydream about the lives they might lead as soldiers.
Paul Baumer says he will enlist, and all the others immediately join him. They start singing The Fatherland.
The boys adjust to army life, and their town mailman, Himmelstas, himself a reservist, is their drill instructor. The boys have difficulty taking him seriously.
He tells them to forget everything you ever knew, what you think you were going to be.
The boys are a sad group and look disorganized and miserable. But they get better the longer they train, marching, singing, crawling in mud. Himmelstas is cruel to them, and he takes pleasure in their misery.
It's funny we see no shooting or weapons drills, just marching. That's almost always a part of what we see in films with army training scenes.
When the boys graduate from basic training, they're assigned to the front, and they're given a leave until midnight. But Himmelstas forces them to crawl through mud, which spoils their leave, so they plan a revenge.
Paul has an idea. They catch a drunk Himmelstas, pants him, spank him, and drop him in a huge mud puddle. All the while, he cried and screamed.
That wasn't even normal screaming.
It was like a girl screaming, like pathetic screaming.
Well, you know what they say about standing up to your bullies.
That they'll scream like babies if you do?
Basically, yeah.
Bullies suck.
Bullies do suck.
The boys arrive in a besieged town. There's a great shot of the village and the hospital train as they head up to the hill to their fates.
They find shelter but no food, and here they join up with their company, and they meet Kaczynski, who's good at staying alive and finding food. They meet some older soldiers as well, Detterling and Jodin, who, like Kat, are older, wiser, and survivors.
The company is taken to do wiring duty at night in a graveyard. The driver tells them, "If there's any of you left, I'll pick you up in the morning."
Yeah, no pressure there.
An artillery shell lands nearby and one of the boys soils himself. Now, that's something you don't see in a movie every day. Kat gives a lot of advice on how to stay alive and avoid shells.
During the wiring, they take shell fire, and one of the boys is wounded by shrapnel before panicking and being killed by machine gun fire. The boys have lost one of their own. Kat says, "It's a corpse. It doesn't matter who he was."
Later, the platoon are in a trench bunker, playing cards and waiting out shelling. Lack of food and rats are a problem. You know, I'm realizing that either things are moving quickly or I'm losing track of time. How long is this after they enlisted? The movie gives us no idea.
Yeah, it's a bit distracting trying to figure that out. Are we still in 1914? Is it 1915? I don't know. And maybe that's the point. In war, you lose track of these things. Dates don't matter. Only staying alive.
Well, anyway, Paul is getting shell-shocked. Stress from lack of sleep and food.
Some of the boys start screaming and panicking. The never-ending barrage is terrifying them. Kat punches the most panicked one out to silence his cries and give them all some release. And then the others don't have to hear him.
This is just a long scene of panic and helplessness. They can't do anything but sit there as their bunker collapses around them slowly with each shell.
Kat somehow finds them some food, but it's not much to spread so far between the company. Then rats attack, and the soldiers fight back. The first major battle we see in the movie is against rats.
When the boys had their daydreams about being soldiers, being buried underground by shell fire and fighting rats for scraps of food wasn't one of the visions they had. War is a lot different when you live it and don't just imagine it romantically.
Yeah, that's a fact. It's basically the whole theme of this film. Eventually the shelling stops. A whistle is blown and the French are attacking, and we get one of the most epic battle scenes ever filmed. They waited a while to get here, but wow.
We see bodies ripped apart by shells and grenades and machine gun fire. Just wave after wave of men being blown to smithereens. There's a wild melee in the German trench as the French overrun their position.
The Germans fall back to the second line, and the French keep attacking. German artillery pushes them back, and the soldiers counterattack. Now the Germans are chopped down in no man's land, just as the French had been. It's almost the exact same scene, but in reverse.
They are ordered back to their own line after taking a French trench, and the exhausted soldiers enjoy a loaf of blood-stained bread and a looted bottle of French wine. The battle having accomplished nothing, and both armies ending up exactly where they began.
As if everything we just saw, every death, every injury, every maiming, all the brutality, it was literally for nothing.
It was literally for nothing.
In the next scene, the company is in a small village, and their numbers are halved. So there's food for 150, but only 80 men arrive. This leads to a feast of double rations. They gorge themselves on beans and bread and meat in silence. But after the meal, they converse about how a war gets started. And it rapidly becomes clear from their philosophizing that they have no idea how it happened or why they are doing this.
When they discuss who needs war, all they can come up with are kings, generals, and manufacturers.
That's a really pointed thing to say in a scene right after the battlefield sequence we just saw. Not only is war pointless and futile, but the average person has no idea why they are subjected to it.
The boys go to see Kemmerich, who is wounded in the shelling. But Kemmerich is in rough shape. They see that his leg has been amputated. Paul stays with Kemmerich and tries to console him. Kemmerich thinks he's dying and asks Paul to give his extremely fine boots to Mueller.
The hospital is filled with dying young men, recovering from amputations and wounds. Paul is distraught at the sight of all this suffering, all this squandered potential of the youth of his nation. Like Himmelstoss said, "Forget everything you thought you were going to be."
Oh man. Oh, I didn't think of that. This is so much more depressing now.
Paul gives the boots to Mueller. He is shaken by seeing Kemmerich die. It made him appreciate the small and too few pleasures in life.
Mueller is all smiles in his boots, but soon he is shot going over the top and dies. And that's it for Mueller.
There's no delineation between the remaining boys and the older men at this point. They're all battle veterans. The company talk of what they have to go home to. Orchards, peat fields, beer gardens, schools, families.
And they take count. Of the 20 kids from the school who enlisted, 9 are dead, 3 are wounded, 1 is insane, and 3 are now officers.
Himmelstoss shows up at the front and joins the company. He wants to be obeyed, but the men have no time for his crap. And once Himmelstoss sees real combat, he shows his cowardice, cowering and whimpering under fire.
In this attack, Paul is wounded and concussed by debris. He tries to find safety, but the French counterattack. And in this mess of it all, Paul and a French soldier end up in the same foxhole. Paul stabs him and his foe dies slowly over the course of the whole night. Paul listens and watches as he wheezes and moans and clings to life.
Paul tries to care for him, giving him water and trying to provide comfort, but eventually he screams at him, wanting the moaning to stop, just die. But then he begs him not to die. When the French soldier does die, Paul apologizes. He explains, "You were my enemy, but you were just a man like me. Say you forgive me. Oh God, why did they do this to us?"
Oh, Paul, this is heartbreaking.
Paul eventually gets back to his lines, but he remains upset over what happened. Kat tries to console him and lets him know it's just war.
It's amazing to see how much this affected Paul. Big battles, it's like he was becoming numb to them, but this personal one-on-one encounter with a soldier that could have been just a French version of himself, totally broke him.
At some point, while on leave and bathing in a river, Paul meets some French girls. And he visits them at night, bringing cheese and sausage and bread, and the girls are clearly starving. They devour the bread and sausages, and they make very nice with the boys, who are hungry for compassion and affection and human contact that isn't conflict. Paul has a calm, intimate, peaceful time with Suzette, and it's a nice bit of respite.
It's funny, usually a scene like this would suggest a character losing his innocence, but Paul's innocence was lost a long time ago. Just in a different way.
Yeah. Even the way Suzette refers to him as a poor boy, a poor soldier, she has compassion for him, since her life has been ruined by the war as well. I'm not so sure Paul is able to seal the deal with her, so to speak. I think the audience can assume that this is a sexual connection for Paul, but I'm not sure he's even capable of that at this point.
That makes sense. He's so ruined by the war, the normal human pleasurable stuff just isn't relatable for him anymore.
On the way back to the front, Paul is wounded by shell fire. He gets taken to a hospital with Albert, who loses a leg to amputation. Paul recovers from his wounds, but Albert is devastated and doesn't want to live.
There's a scene where Albert just stares at a picture of his legs.
Forget what you thought you were going to be.
That line is like the whole theme of this film.
Paul, still in recovery, is granted leave and he decides to return home.
It's not quite as many parties in the streets as when he left over 3 years ago.
No, not at all. The town seems depressed and struggling. Paul's mom is sick and he barely knows his sister. Paul's dad takes him out drinking with his friends, these old men on the home front who know nothing of war, and they're spewing platitudes about how it should be fought and how soldiers should be treated. The best for our soldiers all the time, they say. But Paul knows how inaccurate this is.
I can't get over these beer hall armchair generals who know nothing, saying what ought to be done. They're so out of touch.
Paul tells them, war isn't the way it looks back here. And one of his father's friends tells him, you don't know anything about it.
Paul goes back to his school and sees his teacher, who's still giving the same speeches about enlisting and honor and the glory of going to war for the fatherland. He wants Paul to talk to the students, to share his wisdom with them.
Paul cannot muster much of a pep talk. Looking at these very young faces, he tells them, we try not to be killed. Sometimes we are. That's all.
And immediately, the students call Paul a coward for talking about the uselessness of war. Paul knows the truth, though, saying that when they're at the front, they know that we're lost and done for, dead or alive.
Home is ruined for Paul. Or more accurately, his ability to enjoy the comfort and pleasure of home is destroyed. That part of him, once so connected to the joy of that place, is gone. And he decides to return to the front 4 days before his leave ends.
This is heartbreaking. Paul is such a good guy, and he has been ruined by this. Everything about who he was is gone.
Paul returns to the front, completely disillusioned. Second company is now mostly all kids, 16-year-olds. Paul is one of the old men of the company, and Jodin and Kat had been when he first arrived. He goes to find Kat, who's out looking for food, and the situation at the front is grim. Germany is losing. There's no food, no ammunition, no officers, and no hope of an armistice.
A French plane drops a bomb on them, and Kat's leg is broken. Paul has to carry him, but by the time they reach a medical tent, Kat is dead. The realization hits Paul, and he mourns his friend quickly and moves on while the medical crew resume their card game.
It doesn't matter who he was. That's what Kat had said. We don't know how much time has passed.
We never do.
But Paul is in a trench at the front, and he sees a butterfly. He is rapt by its beauty, and he longs to touch it. We'd seen his collection of mounted butterflies at home in his room. Paul extends his hand, trying to touch the butterfly.
And a French sniper takes aim and fires, and Paul is dead.
Yeah.
Oh my God. What a movie.
What
a movie.
What do we even say about this?
I don't even know, but we have to.
So, my pros. Number 1, there are some tremendous scenes in this movie. All as tonally different as they are equally traumatizing. The first battle scene, the foxhole scene, the second classroom scene, Kat's death, I could go on and on. The source material is so excellently interpreted here by the filmmaker and performers, creating a rich movie that stands the test of time, as well as many repeat viewings. Everyone who would make war should have to watch this film. Number 2, the performances. Aside from Lou Ayres and Louis Folheim as Kat, there are many other great, if smaller, performances in the film. Many of the roles in this movie are small, but they are so well written and acted that they count. For a movie about death, the world within the film is very alive. 3, the lack of a score. Usually I'm very critical of a film that has no accompanying music, but the lack of music in this case only enhances the realism of this movie, letting the emotions it conjures up speak for themselves rather than letting them be guided by a sympathetic score. War is joyless. The cacophony of war, gunfire, explosions, cannon fire, the moans and cries of the dying and the wounded, it's the opposite of music. It's horrible, and it assaults the ears rather than pleases, and a score would have diminished that. It's an artistic choice that almost certainly wouldn't be made today, but it was absolutely the right one. My cons. Number 1. The lack of a clear timeline. It's difficult to know how long things take, or when exactly they're happening. We can assume the opening scene is in September of 1914, but the next time we're given a time check, it's late summer 1917. The vignette-based storytelling style contributes to this, and perhaps sells the point that it doesn't matter when or even where most of the events happen. What matters is they do happen, and that they all have devastating effects on the characters, especially Paul. 2. There are some early parts of the film, especially in the classroom scene, that were filmed when the movie was intended to be silent, so they're shot and acted as a silent film is, and those moments are in disconnect with the aesthetic of sound film. I wish they had reshot them, or just cut them out. And that's it. I admire this film too much, respect its artistic choices and its undeniable impact so much that I have a genuine trouble finding things to critique it over. While it's by no means a perfect film, the impact it has on the viewer is perfect and lasting.
And is this a watch? I mean, how is it not a watch? Spoiler alert, I'm going to say it's a watch, so...
It's more than a watch, really. It's required viewing. People should watch this, not just cinephiles, not just film historians, not just kids in film school. Everyone. It should be on TV every year on November 11th, the way A Christmas Carol is on December 24th. A reminder of the cost of war, the folly of war, the pain and cruelty of war, of how war destroys what is best. No film does it better. You're up.
Okay, so my pros. 1. The very opening with the doors. I thought this was such a cool shot. I loved how we started in this house with those people cleaning, and then the guy opened the doors, and we could see everything happening in the street. I don't know why, but I really love cool shots like that, and I wasn't really expecting something like that from this movie, so it was a pleasant surprise. Another shot I liked was the sequence with the boots. I liked how the camera was just following the boots through those scenes while occasionally moving up to see Mueller with that freaking smile on his face. It just made the moment of those boots falling down into the trench when he died so good. 2. Paul. What a guy. You could see that he was staying happy and positive, or at least trying to at the beginning, because he was just such a good guy. But then we just watched him get worse and worse. When he goes on leave, it was so sad to watch. He couldn't enjoy anything because he was so messed up from the war. It was honestly so heartbreaking to watch him slowly just break down and lose it. It was so sad to watch it happen to literally everyone in the movie. But it was so well done. 3. The battle scenes. Oh my god. That's all I have to say. The entire ground, pulsated as freaking everything exploded. People were dropping left and right. The hands on the barbed wire. The melee fighting in the trench. Just, oh my god. It was absolutely brutal, but I could not look away for a second. So, it was honestly really hard to come up with many cons at all, and I had to trim down my pros list by a lot, so the cons that I do have are pretty weak. But here are my cons. 1. The first few scenes. Dad, I remember when you told me about how the film was originally supposed to be silent, but they didn't reshoot the opening scenes when they started using sound, and it was noticeable. All of the big and exaggerated movements and gestures, it was really strange to watch, and it was super out of place with the rest of the movie. I'm just saying, I think they could have standed to reshoot one or two scenes. 2. Himmelstoss. This guy, he was a real jerk when he was training everyone, so I thought it was pretty funny when the guys jumped him. But he was such a wimp about it. He was straight up screaming like a girl. It was pathetic. Then he actually gets sent to the front, and he freaks out and cries because he got a scratch on his hand when people are literally dying all around him. He was the worst. 3. This is honestly so weak that I'm not even sure it's an actual con. But the music that started playing when Paul was in the trench after Kat's death. Considering the lack of that kind of music in the rest of the film, it felt kind of weird and out of place. But that moment with Paul reaching his hand out towards the butterfly and then his hand going limp, I would not change a single thing.
All right. And is this a watch for you?
Yes.
Okay, as the spoiler alert said. Okay, deep exhale.
Yeah.
And that was our episode on All Quiet on the Western Front.
More like our episode on one of the greatest movies I've ever seen. Just wow. Wow.
Yep, fair enough.
How do we even follow that? Seriously.
Well, we do. We always do. We'll just have another killer film.
That's a good plan.
But until then, as always, thanks for listening. And if you liked what you heard, please hit like, subscribe, and share. And most importantly, don't keep it to yourself. After all, we are not a secret.
So tell your friends.
Tell your enemies.
You never know. They might enjoy some movies about the horrible reality of war as much as you do.
Maybe even more. For Sam the Sidekick, I'm Derek, and I love old movies. Additional research for I Love Old Movies, the podcast, is done by Nikki Weatherden. Audio clips come from freefx.co.uk. Images are used through the provisions of fair use, and our theme song, Burning Bridges, is by The Crocs.